I get a little excited when the slack line is used in the way that I'd like it. I'd like to consider it it's used. That it's a form of allowing us to commune when we can't be in each other's presence. Because if I throw out for you a thought, it might be something that's a little bit surprising, but it's very, very true. As close knit as we like to believe that we are, very few of us, if any of us, call each other, let alone visit each other during the course of the week. And I would suggest to you that 100 years ago, if not even probably pre-1942, people's ideal and their practice with church brethren was very, very different than what we do now, what we have now. So we joke around about it in some regard that we don't know our neighbors. But I certainly remember my parents growing up that it was very commonplace for folks who lived in another place to say, hey, I need maple syrup, I need X and so, and then they would come and they would bring their container over to our house and then it would get filled up. So we live in a world right now where some of us live in neighborhoods and developments and we really don't even know our neighbors. So the Slack as a virtual communication coordinator is one that allows us to visit with each other in some regard, even because our inclination is not to visit and check up on each other. So when we have a really good thread that we respond to, that's exciting, certainly for me to see. So I appreciate Brother Steve and Diane posting some articles to have us be able to think about and then respond, because some of that stuff helps to inform leadership as to what the Lord may be impressing upon us to be able to present. And that's why it's important. You've heard Bruce say this through the years, and I would hope that this is something that Brother Gene espouses as well. It's neat that David Jeremiah is David Jeremiah. It's neat that who did A Purpose-Driven Life? Rick Warren. It's neat that Rick Warren is who he is. It's neat that Billy Graham was who he was. But your local leader, your local pastor has a message that's specific for you. So it's neat for you potentially to go and see David Jeremiah, but if you blow off your gathering to not get the message that your local leader has, in many ways you're missing the message that was specifically for you. So that's all I'll say about that, and hopefully if you've got some commentary, that will come either during the course of the week or even during our time together today. But I would like to make something a little outstanding to have us consider, because Steve asked a question in the thread this week as he presented the concept of Christian nationalists, and then the concept of people using icons and using the cross and the rosary, etc., to inform that this is a piece of their armor or this is a piece of their weaponry in order to go and expedite battles in the name of the Lord in some regard as Americans. And Steve asked the question, who's the bad guy? In the 70s, it got very, very popular. And look, as much as we like to think that Christians are very deep, very complex individuals, we're about as superficial as the next guy without the Holy Spirit. And so you may not remember in the 70s, but very, very much a popular phrase became T-shirt and bumper sticker oriented, and even made its way, it may have actually originated from a comedian, and it was something that permeated for quite some time, almost until WWJD took over. And that was the concept of the devil made me do it. Thank you. Appreciate seeing some of your head nodding there. That was a very, very big idea. And look, not only, it was so big that Christians kind of adopted that. And I would suggest to you in some regard that, yes, the father of lies is responsible for the fall, but you can't take away Adam's decision-making. You can't take away Adam's decision-making. And so when you make the adversary the bad guy, then what we kind of do is we eliminate a lot of 1 John. We eliminate the concept that if indeed we are adopted into Jesus' family through his shed blood, and it is finished means it is finished, it means we're not supposed to be slaves to making the stupid decisions that don't honor and glorify God. That's the new position that we're put into. So it's very churchified for us to blame the state of the world on the adversary. Because, yes, he certainly was the culprit, but the decision maker to follow the trail of the deceiver, that's all on Adam. And subsequently, that gets to be on us as well. And so partly, I'm suggesting that to you to say this. When we look at the adversary being the bad guy, and being in many ways the sole bad guy, there is no way, unless you have a screw tape letter relationship, unless you have a cosmological relationship that some of us don't know about, you are not going to change that particular bad guy's heart. But when we take a look at some of the perpetrators in Steve's article, and even maybe in Diane's rebuttal, our purpose is to change the hearts of those players, and those players are mortals like we are. We don't have an opportunity to change the mindset and the hearts of the fallen angels. We don't have the mindset to change the heart of the adversary. But we can change these folks who consider themselves Christian nationalists, and maybe not as a group, but one-on-one. We can change the heart of potentially the folks writing these authors caught up in the how do I make a name for myself mindset today, one-to-one, if not through kind of a group orientation, like what we're doing right now. And so I'm going to throw out for you to consider that when we want to say who's the bad guy, who's at fault here, remember, part of the reason that we gather, well, why do we gather? Why are we doing this? Anybody know? That's actually a question for you guys. What?
It's my answer from last week. Oh,
I'm
well,
sorry?
yeah, it's my answer from last week, right?
What would that be?
Well, it was our mission statement. It was basically to become a praying people that work together. I can't remember the exact wording now. I have to go back to my notes because Steve just put me on the spot, and I'm going to put him on the spot later if he's not careful. I'd have to go back to my notes, but yeah, but we talked about it. It's, praying people, right, to come together and basically expand the kingdom of God.
Impact the world.
Impact the world. Thank you. That's what we're looking for.
Impact the world. Why?
This ain't all there is.
Did you hear me?
Impact this world
For Jesus.
For the next.
For the
next.
Yes. That's
So,
true.
folks, how do we do that? How do we, as praying people equipped by Jesus, how do we impact this world for the next?
Most of us, it's going to be one individual at a time. None of us, well, not many of us get to be Rick Warren, a David Jeremiah, or a
Ed Hoagland.
Charles Stanley, Ed Hoagland.
Ed Hoagland is what Diane said.
Yeah, not of us get a chance to be that. And that may just be a matter of lack of response. I think we may have opportunities we don't see. But it is going to be
as we go,
as we go.
whatever throughout our life, whatever we do, we take those opportunities to witness.
So if indeed you all believe that you just sort of cobbled together there, that we're praying people equipped by Jesus to impact this world for the next, which I think is hopefully 15 words or less to describe what we should be about. How impactful are we going to be if we believe the adversary is the bad guy in order to impact this world for the next?
We have an opportunity as we go to help people realize which wolf they're feeding. And we can help them realize that, we have a nature within us, Christians especially, whichever one we feed the most is the one that's going to be the most powerful, the strongest. And I'm not advocating that Christians are possessed by the devil or anything like that, but we can still be influenced. And we have to, like we do right now, help other people realize, help each other realize that what we're doing, what we may consider doing, what we're planning to do, may not be in the kingdom's best interest. And so we have to evaluate the source. And that's why I put out what I did, was that he's the source of all of this. And these people are allowing themselves, yes, to making a decision, allowing themselves to be influenced because they've been given this promise of notoriety and fame and material goods and all that kind of thing. They're falling for the promise, not standing on the promises.
So, there's nothing untrue, Brother Gene, in what you're saying. It brings to mind a story I just recently told my wife that she thought was funny enough she had to tell my kid, and it may not sound funny to you at all. And in context, some of you old folks may find some of this funny, but it's a lesson that I use that's been a go-to since sixth grade. In sixth grade, we had an assignment in science, and the assignment was you need to create a slogan that's anti-drug usage. And so, as a sixth grader, I had two things going on. Number one, I kind of liked good grades, but I didn't want to really work for them. And number two, sometimes I thought assignments were stupid. So getting them done and getting them done quickly was kind of my priority. So when the assignment came in, I felt pretty good about it because I figured I'd be able to turn it in real doggone quickly. Because the slogan that I chose was, "Baby, baby, don't get hooked on me." And I say that some of you, while I'm watching some of you older people chuckle, that's part of the jazz here. So I turned it in with a kind of, I think, a big contact capsule. You guys remember Contact? Take your contact. It was this little kind of capsule thing, and it had a million different little colored things in it. It looked like it was kind of candy, but it wasn't. So I'm not advocating trying drugs to see if they're candy or not. But I drew a picture of that, and kind of there was a black background, and the capsule had all these colored little things in it, and then the slogan was, "Baby, baby, don't get hooked on me." And I went, this has got to be an instant A. So I turned it in early, and the teacher gave it back, and she said, "Do it again." She said, "It's too pithy." She said, "You didn't think at all about this. You need to come up with your own slogan, and don't come up with something that's jingle-esque like this." Now, I hated that because now it meant I needed to do some work. I needed to reconsider the road I was on. And so sometimes if we're together, if you see me kind of saying the thing, which is one of my my go-to phrases, the Sunday school answer, that's in some regard where it came from. Is the teacher pretty much looked at the work I presented that I thought was really good, and she went, "Go back and think about this and do it again." The funny thing is, I don't remember what I came up with. It was I guess it was acceptable. I think I got a decent grade on it, but I remember actually the failure as opposed to remembering what it was that got the teacher to say, "Okay, this works." So, folks, I'm challenging us to think always, certainly, look, the whole Bible always tells us where the source of adversarial contest comes from. We know that. Our mission is to change the world. And how we change the world, and Diane reminded us of this in her content, how we change the world is a person at a time. And the folks who changed the world, there were 12 of them. And those 12, in many ways, have shaped this world that allowed the United States to be founded on Judeo-Christian principles. So it's not impossible. It certainly may look almost insurmountable, but that's keeping our eyes, using a church phrase, on the prize. And it's acting the way that Bruce preached last week prior to Trent giving his baptism speech, on purpose. On purpose. Running the race every day. Understanding the outcome, understanding the consequences, understanding the training that's involved. So let me pause there and allow you to slap me around a little bit.
A question for you.
Oh,
I got a question about last week's video. When they were talking about, truth is truth, and when someone comes in, you don't use their pronouns.
Yeah.
So, question, if you immediately cut somebody off when they just walked in the door, you had no opportunity for them to hear the word, right? So I am conflicted about that because, we all are walking around sinful, right? We could all be turned away at the door. I just think it's got to be something in between. Yeah, we don't falsify what the truth is, but we also got to minister to the hurt first before we can minister to the soul.
So I appreciate you speaking up there, Di, because I actually said, when Steve showed that video, I said, Diane's going to have a tough time with this.
Yeah.
And partly, I think some of the challenges, you've got your kids right now that you're battling in a world that where it's becoming more and more acceptable to see the latest article I posted in Slash.
Yeah.
Where not only are we calling things as they're not, but now our parents are endorsing earlier and earlier that those calling things that they're not is perfectly fine for their kids in this world. So what we're doing is we're endorsing the lie, and parents are endorsing the lie. So here's a bit of the pushback that I would give, and then I'll shut up and allow you guys to weigh in, because I appreciated Steve bringing that in, because that was a hard lesson to listen to, and I've been one of those. I've been following J.D. Greear for quite some time. So when he became the president, one of the items that was a part of his agenda is he made a public apology to the LGBTQ, et cetera, audience, to say that Christians have done it incorrectly for a while. And here's the funny thing. He's right about that, but he's also wrong in presenting an apology, because what Christians don't do well is we're not good listeners. We've learned so much, even from church, in a weird way, that we need to soul win, or we need to give our testimony. And so Christians actually listen to people with the intent of, let me tell you what I have to say, let me tell you what I have to say, let me tell you what I have to say. And so maybe sometimes the response, Di, to what you're saying is this. When you encounter a person, sometimes people are very quick to tell you what they're about, what their agenda is, et cetera. Just shut up and listen for a bit. Just shut up and listen. Because if we do that well, they're going to tell you what questions, and this is a really good way to get involved, what questions to ask them next. Now, you're going to fall on your face if you do this in a group and you tell the whole group, I'm sorry, I'm going to call you by your God-given genetics. But if you're with one person, one-on-one, one at a time, and you listen to them, you get a chance to build a little bit of relationship by saying, look, this is where I come from. And I understand that this is kind of what you feel is your truth, but I'm working from a position of empirical truth by the creator of the universe. And I'd like to be able to re-engage in a conversation in the future, but I have to tell you, I'm going to struggle with calling you a pronoun that was not one that was reflected by your birth. I think that kind of honesty, that kind of exchange in a one-on-one situation allows you an opportunity to re-engage. So let me quiet down there. Since you threw that grenade out there, Diane, let's talk a little bit about it.
I was thinking, how can you talk to someone without using any pronouns? That's almost like, you feel like when you're out in the world today, it's like, I don't even want to say, how you doing? And thank you, ma'am. Or, I'm always brought up to say, yes, sir, no, sir, yes, ma'am. I really think about it now, and that's sad. I don't know. Conflicted.
I would argue that that's the point.
That's the confliction.
Yes,
Yeah, true.
that's the point.
They want
You don't even know how to speak to someone, so you simply don't. That's the point.
Well, I've gotten so generic that, you know, sometimes it will lead to a conversation and sometimes not, but I'm very generic.
Yeah, but I also tend to look at it from, let's look down the road from that initial meeting. So if you go through your initial meeting with that person who has gender dysphoria and you humor them and you say, okay, well, you say you're a she when you're really a he. And you go to that point and then you try to establish and build that relationship with them. And then you get to the point where you start talking about Jesus and telling them what, okay, you know, the truth in itself is kind of harsh if you want to stop and think about it, because it
It's
is
true. You're
it's-
not going to want to hear it.
we live in a society where everything's got to be inclusive,
Right.
and the truth is by its nature exclusive.
Yeah.
2 + 2 is 4, and there's a billion other numbers it's not.
One day it will be a hate group, right?
Right. So if you establish that relationship and you humor them at the beginning, and then you get to the point where you're talking about Jesus and you tell them this is truth, and then they're going to be really conflicted. They're going to be confused because, like, well, wait, if you don't believe that I'm a she,
Mhm.
why did you humor me to begin with? Why did you do this way at the very beginning of our relationship? Have you been deceiving me this whole time to get me to play along so you can get me to this point?
And that's when the easy part comes in, because you say, because I want what's best for you. I want you to know who this man is because he can change your life like he has done mine. But yeah, getting to that point, how do you get to that if you've already closed it down earlier? The minute you won't acknowledge who they think they are, they're out.
Yeah, their whole issue is to guilt you into accepting what they
Right.
say they are.
But that's what our whole, I don't know what you want to call it, environment right now is. If you say one thing against somebody, they're out the door. They won't engage you in a conversation. So I don't know. It's a fine line between not inclusive and just totally not being able to have a conversation. I guess that was my only fear. I don't want to just totally knock somebody off without the opportunity to share what Jesus can do for them. You know, it's not going to be an easy road. It's not an easy road for any of us. We're always dealing with sin, but how do you get to that point?
Good news. The pronoun you is not gender specific.
See? I'm with you there. But you can't say, hey, you.
Why not?
Sure.
Sure you can.
You can just say you need to listen.
What's their name?
Mm-hmm.
So folks, if
You don't know if it's their real name or.
Yeah.
And you don't know where they started either. Is my point. You come up to somebody and their appearance is very convincingly one gender, and then unless you engage them in conversation, you don't learn that they actually started out someplace else gender wise. So it's kind of it's a weird world.
Yes, it is.
folks, it's certainly a weird world. But I'm gonna err on the side of what Solomon says: is there's nothing new under the sun, right? This kind of stuff has happened before in different civilizations. I would suggest this might have been going on in Sodom and Gomorrah, if we're just going to get Bible about stuff, right? Please recognize, if we're going to identify the adversary as the root of all bad, as the root of all, well, the root of stuff we don't cause ourselves, right? We've talked about this, and so, when Diane says it's a fine line, I think the adversary wants us to think it's a fine line. I don't know that it's a fine line, because what's going on right now, folks, is a committed strategy that's taken thousands of years for civilization. And a being, in many ways, who can outlast us, who outlives us, who can prey on our pride. And right now, we're in the perfect mixing bowl, the perfect storm of sorts, where we just came through COVID, which says people are off limits. We have this identification culture going on right now that's created, where Diane is rightly describing this, a sense of chaos and confusion in terms of socialization and even interaction. Because now, not only can you not get next to people, right? Now you have to be careful in what you say to people. And so perhaps the best answer is don't say anything. Don't approach people. Don't say anything. And so this environment of the identification stuff going on in the United States, in the West, maybe in the world period, combined with the confusion and the chaos, and then the COVID world, is the perfect miasma for the adversary to feel like, well, I know I'm ultimately going to lose, but right now, I'm scoring pretty high on the losing win chart. And so, folks, it's important for us to be able to.
I was just going to congratulate you on your alliteration.
You're rubbing off on me, Gene. It's important for us, folks, day by day and week by week, to accept opportunities to interact with folks, because by doing that, some of that helps us to gain skill. Some of that helps us to recognize how to navigate the tricky situations. But you got to get in there. And it's almost like a few weeks back, you heard my wife talking about praying with a lady in Tennessee that she just met. It felt yucky doing it, but once it was over, it felt like a grand celebration. For those of you who are artists, for those of you who are athletes, even in the room there, sometimes that first game in front of a crowd is the one that you need to have that then takes the mystery off of being able to go and trying and do it again. But you have to get out there and you have to try to do it. And look, folks, there are going to be instances where you fall on your face. That's why we gather. That's why we gather, to be able to talk about it. And that's partly where that Jesus encounter comes from, because some days it's gonna feel like you're on top of the world, and some days it's gonna feel like you should be buried under a big, huge mountain. But you got to practice. And so there are some things that, here's the simplest one I can tell you. I don't necessarily get into it with identification culture with folks, but sometimes I'll get into it with folks who are of a different religion. And one of the things I'll try to do up front is to establish that we're across the net in badminton. We're across the badminton net, but we can still talk. And I'm willing to listen to what it is that you have to say, but you have to also be willing to listen to what I have to say. So we set the rules in the beginning to be able to create a volley. And that's how perhaps we offset what Steve talks about, is how down the road then can you tell someone, well, this is really where I'm coming from, because the person can say, but that's not where you started off. So you want to set the rules and the parameters in the beginning, and then look forward to, as well as establishing the volley. So let me quiet down there and see if that comments or thoughts.
Preston, what you just said, I think is pretty valid in my way of looking at it. To go Bible for a second, I think it's an Acts 17 thing for me. Paul on Mars Hill, maybe I'm wrong to do this, but I tend to want to kind of take the long view. And I realize that we've got to be timely because we don't know what tomorrow holds. But I've always appreciated the fact that Paul didn't try to hit a home run the first time. He was trying to open the door. And so for me, and I think it's more, I've not really had the opportunity to engage somebody who's not the gender they were born with, or masquerading as the wrong one or whatever like that. But certainly when it comes to other faiths, I think you're exactly right. We have to be, I think the two things we miss in our world today, and Christian culture is guilty of this as any, is we miss out on honesty and grace. We tend to fall short on that. And I think we also tend to fall short on the reality that if you were in your job, if somebody came in and said something to you that you knew was just patently wrong, you would have very little trouble telling them that they're wrong because you're an expert in your field. But we tend not to think of ourselves as experts when it comes to the Bible. And so, but for me, I think about this kind of ongoing conversation I've got going with this Jehovah's Witness guy. And from the get-go, I told him, I don't agree with what you're doing. And I'd like to share that with you. But we didn't blow each other up on the first conversation so we could keep it going. And to me, I think you're right. We don't want to misrepresent, but we may not be allowed by the Holy Spirit to necessarily go for the fences on that first conversation either. So we've got to be willing to have the win for the next conversation when they will give us another hearing.
So two things. Number one, as you began your sixth grade story, I really, really thought that you were going to tell us that you originated this is your brain on drugs, any questions? I really thought that's what you were going to tell us. That's where it came from. Number two, I had a thought occur to me. We actually went to some military honors on Friday, and they played taps. And this young fella in uniform played a beautiful rendition of it. Crystal clear notes, no trip ups, no nothing, just beautiful. And then as we're traveling back, I'm thinking, I wonder if people remember where that tune comes from. And if they remember where that tune comes from, how long is it going to be before the military, the American military, says we cannot use that anymore at military honors for our fallen military? Because unless I'm very much mistaken, historian, there are two accounts of this. Number one, Stonewall Jackson had lost an officer or a soldier, and he wanted to commemorate him, and he basically hummed in the bugler's ear the tune we now know as Taps to honor him. And then I was reminded by my mother-in-law in our discussion on this, when Stonewall Jackson died, they actually found the tune in his pocket. So here's the question. Here is a Confederate soldier who originates something that's used by all the military to this day. If they realize that it's come from a Confederate soldier, is that going to get canceled?
Well, it's not a statute, so probably not.
The statute?
I'll have
It's
to go
not
look
visual
that up.
representation.
I'll have to look that up because Stonewall Jackson's my relative. I'll have to go look that up and see.
Oh, now we're going to cancel you too.
I've already done. I have been canceled multiple times. It's all good.
Okay.
It's all good.
Kicked out.
Yeah, canceled, kicked out on a weekly basis. I don't know.
I do have a confession to make.
Please do, because I'm waiting for this. I keep looking. You can't see Preston, but I keep looking at Steve going, are you going to say something? Because he's been wanting to say this for a couple days. So
No, I have a confession to make. When I posted the article on Slack, I had a different intention. And and so the questions that I asked, probably the first question wasn't worded the way I should have worded it, but it took on a life of its own with some really excellent and wonderful responses. So I decided I'm going to stay quiet and see where this goes.
because channeling his inner Preston.
So yeah, I just wanted to say that I had a different intention behind those articles, but where it went was wonderful.
So what was your intention?
Oh my goodness. She just baited him.
You walked
Well, I
into it.
didn't want you to ask that question.
But you walked into it because Sherry even asked it too, or Diane did. One of them says, what was your intention?
Mm-hmm. Well, I was going to ask it too.
What I should have asked is based on the viewpoint of the authors of the articles, who is the bad guy? And where is this going from here? Which is a different question from where it ended up going, which actually I think worked out great. But I tend to look at those things from a very, maybe it's my background or whatever, but I always look at the first question I ask when I see articles like
What's
that
the
is
source?
consider the source. Who's the source? What is the source's bias? What sources does this source use to support their position? And so when you look at it, the two sources were CNN and Atlantic. So what's their bias? Where do they lean? Well, just like if I was reading an article from Fox, I would know that they lean to the right. CNN and the Atlantic lean to the left. So how do they view the world? How do they view things? Well, if you're typically people on the right see things as individuals. You make individual decisions and individual choices. People on the left see things as a collective. So when you look at and you say this group of people are Christian nationalists, then you begin to identify everyone who uses the title Christian as Christian nationalists. So if you look at the sources was an author of a book called Jesus and John Lane, which is a person who has admittedly, she has in the past, she's a historian, she's not a theologian. She has historically in the past pointed out things like, I have a disdain for evangelical Christians. She wrote the book from a viewpoint of, this is how after a certain period of time, Christianity began to support Donald Trump. That was her entire thesis of her book. The person they referenced from a Christian college was a sociologist, not a theologian. And then the other articles that they link to are other opinion columns from left-leaning sources. They never went to anybody that's on a conservative side to say that this is any type of major national movement of white Christian nationalism. So that was part of what I was sort of angling at. And then I was looking at the second article about linking the rosary and AR-15s. And they used a term in there that I thought was fun, rad trad, or radical traditionalist, as if being a traditional is all of a sudden radical. So in my take on those articles was simply this: these are opinion pieces written prior to November elections to essentially say people that hold these beliefs are bad. These are the bad guys. And what that typically tends to do is that sort of a lead up. If you look at the period in from 1933, prior to the start of World War II, and you look at Nazi Germany, what type of propaganda was going on in regards to the Jewish people, this is the exact type of thing that was being put out in German newspapers about the Jews. So the point I was trying to make is this is the beginning of people pointing out Christians bad. Begin to look at these people as a set group that holds certain beliefs that are bad. And there are other comments. People that came out this week, an ex-former CIA director said, if you support Donald Trump, you're evil. Look, I'm not saying I'm not a particularly great Trump fan. I think he did some good things. I think he did some stupid things. I don't necessarily care about that aspect of it. What I'm looking at is how they're linking Christianity to these things that they're saying is bad. Yeah. But the direction that ended up going in was just great, so I just let it go.
Yeah, I wanted to kind of add, I appreciate that, and because that was when I first looked at these articles, I'm going, okay, so once again, we're supposed to be tolerant of everybody but Christians. That's what it comes down to. And so because Christians are the bad guys. They're the ones messing everything up. And so now I'm going to throw into this, an additional mix that I had happen this week. I'm sitting in the library, because I do that sometimes. And I'm reading, and I look up, and I'm thinking, and then I look across at the magazine rack. And I see a magazine that talks about the dilemma that the Attorney General is in. And it's on a magazine called The New Republic. Okay, now, I'd never heard of that. Now, was it
Star Wars.
Star Wars. Gently.
The New Republic was actually started publishing back in the early 20th century. I mean, very early, 1912 or something like that. And as I'm reading the article about the Attorney General, I'm going, well, they are making no effort at all to disguise their point of view. They are liberal. I mean, liberal. And so I went to go find out some information about this magazine, and their history is basically thinking people promoting liberalism from back in 1912. And I'm like, okay, so I understand that, and I don't pretend to understand a lot of this, okay? But I thought I understood that there's been a flip-flop that's happened when it comes to our two-party system, where what was liberal is now conservative and vice versa, because we've already said that it was indeed the Democrats that were on board for a lot of the things that they're now actually saying that they oppose. And so I'm looking at this article and I'm going, so back in 1912, what was liberal? What was conservative? Where are we? And so I just put that out there. It's kind of like, I knew a guy when I first started working in data processing. I worked down on the south side on Sims Avenue, and we had a security guard that was older than most security guards, we'll put it that way. And he had been around a while, and he said that he was claiming to be a Republican. He's going, the Republicans are not what they used to be. I didn't understand that then because I'm just a kid. And now I begin to understand things have changed. So here's my question. If a rank liberal magazine, The New Republic, is still very, very liberal, what were they supporting back in the early 20th century? And how would that have changed? And is this a magazine that if I lived back then, I would have said, yeah, right on. Anybody help?
So you probably need to chat with Steve about this, because what he'll probably talk with you about is the introduction of progressivism that's going to begin with the Woodrow Wilson campaign and presidency, and that will help you to plug in from a historical standpoint to what liberalism looked like and how it was introduced into the administration, and then how it made its way steadily through the FDR administration to Johnson, and then how we are where we are today. I think that's where I think that Steve would probably engage you. Am I pretty close there, Brother Steve?
Say again?
Yes.
Okay, yeah.
I don't really like the term liberal very much anymore. It's more, liberal basically used to mean you're about individual choice, you're about freedom of free speech, and those type of things. Progressive is a totally different thing. It's more of a progressive invasion of what used to be known as liberalism.
Socialists. Well, and now that you say that, and particularly on the heels of what President said, one of the things that I read about the history of this magazine was this group was influential on an FDR. And I think even a Woodrow Wilson. Very, very, I think that's what their history said. This group and this magazine was influential with the very people you mentioned. So maybe I'm just using my terms incorrectly. I apologize. Thank you.
So to move out of the socio-political arena and move more toward why we gather on a Sunday, even though this is of import, be aware that the Fourth Estate is kind of an unelected branch of government when it's done well. And so when we say that the press has an influence on government, on the judicial leg, on the executive wing, indeed it does. And when it's done well, it's an extra check and balance. But again, that's a different discussion, not necessarily for church people who didn't sign up for that history and socio-political engagement. But Brother Steve can probably talk with you about that ad infinitum offline. And folks, there's really good stuff about that. I would also tell you that's a good place to use the Slack line for, to help Christians understand how we got from 1776 to today. The Whigs and Tories and all that sort of stuff is quite important to get us to the modern day Republicans, et cetera.
which is why I made the comment that I did, because I think that we're getting to the place where some of our forefathers were back in the mid 18th century, where they were not treated fairly, and we're not. They were oppressed. We are. And the more you begin to look at the lead up to the American Revolution, some of our forefathers had to actually take up arms and become, perish the thought, violent in order to try to stand up for their rights. I get what you're saying with the power of the Holy Spirit and the power of God, and I'm not saying we need to help God, but I also don't want to discount the brave people that fought for us to have what we have right now.
And to your point, Pastor Bruce made a brilliant observation in that exchange in talking about picking up arms. Because one of the points I made to him during the course of the week was, well, I want to make sure I let folks know that some of the early proponents of the Revolutionary War were Presbyterian ministers, Presbyterian pastors, helped to lead that charge. And Pastor Bruce brilliantly responded to me saying, I don't believe, though, that they were acting according to scriptural principles. But what they did do is they counted potentially the cost. They counted the consequences of what that battle would, what the results of that battle would look like in terms of lost life, privileges, etc. And I don't know that church people are very, very good at counting the cost, especially in this day and age where impulsivity and I want, by the way, which is kind of our topic today, I want, sometimes is the permeating ideal. We don't count the cost. So we're not going to finish this certainly today, and that's okay, because it's certainly a good ramping up. So let's take a look at 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10. To keep me, and this is Paul speaking as usual, to keep me from becoming conceited because of these surpassingly great revelations, there was given me a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan, to torment me 3 times. I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. I will boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, and difficulties, for when I am weak, then I am strong. So we're really on a theme as we're closing out these personal questions before we transition to our next step with this particular study. And that precipice upon which we're balanced right now has to do with contentment. We see it played out for Paul here because Paul talks about contentment in other parts of his writings, but here he talks about I delight in. And delighting certainly suggests a great deal of contentment. And so Sarah supported some of the thinking this morning by sending out to you some lyrics. I hope that perhaps anybody that received this information, have you seen these lyrics before? Are you familiar with them? All right, thank you, Bruce. Appreciate that. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that too. And this is from a song that was drafted back in, I think, 1956, published about 1959. And depending on your church background, your affiliation, sometimes we're very, very, what's the word? Self-contained as churches in terms of what the content of our hymnals look like. So for a lot of you in our exchange today, if you were brought up Baptist, you have a Baptist hymnal. Now, surprisingly, there are a lot of classics that make their way into all hymnals. So you'll see Rock of Ages, for instance. What's my favorite by? It's funny, when I'm looking to think for these, I can't think of them, but then I have lyrics in my head all the time. So some of the classics make their way into all the hymnals. This is one that you'll find in the Methodist hymnal. And funnily and surprisingly, you'll find this in both the United Methodist hymnal and you'll find this in the African Methodist Episcopal hymnal. And this is perhaps a little bit of to demonstrate to you that praise and worship music is not a new thing. It's people have been writing songs that are not the Psalms or right out of the Scripture for quite some time. And when this was penned, the author, I think, who's a guy named Blanchard, I think. When this was penned, he was kind of in the middle of the big band, swing era, etc. So he used some of the orchestration, etc., to make this song singable for the time that it was presented. Now, I can tell you, this is a song that when I was a kid growing up in church, this was a song that was sung often. And I can also tell you, typically when it was sung, I absolutely hated it. Hated this. And I hated this in part because of something that one of you mentioned earlier today. I can't remember if it was Steve or if it was maybe Brother Gene, but you talked about the way that we think and operate when we're kids. That's very, very different when we become adults. And part of the reason I hated this song was twofold. Number one, in the church that I grew up in, this song could go on for close to 30 minutes. This song could go on for like 30 minutes. And this was the kind of song that especially, it's funny sometimes hanging out with us and having Brother Gene several weeks back do a celebratory session with you all, because I enjoy gathering with us, but for the most part, if I'm honest, we're not very celebratory people when we gather. And I say that because as a comparison, in the church I grew up in, and in a lot of churches that are of similar nature, and I would tell you probably churches that are very charismatic, folks expect their celebration and their gathering time to be emotional. They expect it to. And in fact, if they don't have an emotional or a cathartic kind of response, they don't think that they gathered in a way that was meaningful. And so in the church I grew up in, when this song was played, and it could go on, and it would go on, and then this was the kind of song that, for instance, would, especially if my dad were particularly inclined on this day, not only would he be particularly into this, but he'd probably be weeping. And then while the song was going on, people were taking opportunities to walk down to the altar and pray, and it would go on. And as a young man, as a young boy, I promised myself I would never, ever sing/play this kind of stuff, ever. Because this was church, this was a downer. So let me pause there for a second and see if you have any thoughts or comments about that before we dig into it a little.
No.
We had it in our hand and led this song.
We've got a couple folks talking.
This was in our hymnal. I used to lead this song back in the day. But it was more like 30, not 30.
My experience my experience with this song, the church that I grew up in, was this was a song that a lot of soloists sang. And I can remember people getting up and going to the altar during it.
Yeah, Jerry, I think you're kind of referring to one of my favorite church areas, special music. So have you read through the words?
Some folks have them memorized here. Never heard it before until you sent the lyrics out. I don't have a clue what this even is. No, I don't know what this is.
Beat that child.
Again, I'm getting kicked out, so excellent.
Brother Chris?
Grew up in a very conservative church. The hymnal was, very thick, but If this song was there, I wouldn't know it because we only sang the same 10 songs out of a book that's, hundreds. But I've never seen it. But then there's certain verses in here that are like, wait a minute, that's straight out of this other hymn that we sang all the time.
See, I'm not the only one who hasn't heard this one, so thank you, Chris, for helping me out. Okay, just saying.
So, anybody think of any idea where the inspiration for this song comes from?
I can only perhaps speak to the motivation. I do not know the hymnology to this, but it's a plea that, I'm kind of sick of who I am. Lord, change me into what I ought to be. Fill me with what I need to have in order to do that. The whole, fill me up. And this is almost kind of like a weekly thing. I'm going into the new week. Monday's tomorrow. I need to get filled up for the coming week and be ready for whatever is ahead. That's my understanding of the motivation. I don't know the inspiration, like I said, hymnology of it.
I would guess Jesus's conversation with the Samaritan woman at the well.
You're getting an ovation from Preston.
Someone who
Yeah.
has not been satisfied with things as they are and wanting more, but realizing that it's not going to come from the worldly things, that it's going to come from the Lord. And
So I would challenge that on the rare occasions that I'm forced or I'm listening to today's praise and worship music that's not hymn oriented, this is not the content of the praise and worship music that's being sung today. And as an old guy now, not as the kid who hated the 30 minutes and the weeping and the crying and people going down to the altar praying for this kind of experience, I look at this differently now, and I can see the truth, the significance, the understanding, and the import of what's contained here.
When we're young, and it's been a while, when we're young, we do have an attitude of, when's it's gonna be over? Because we're at the unless of course it's something we chose, and that's a whole other matter. But we're at church because someone said we're supposed to be there. Somebody brought us there. We're not driving. We're at the mercy of other folks who provide the transportation. And so it's like, how long I'm getting hungry. It's time for lunch, maybe dinner. How about breakfast? Can this end? And when you hear something like this, and you hear those first notes, name that tune, and all of a sudden it's like, oh no, this is going to be 30 minutes, and they're going to do that. And you know what? They're in certain church environments. You know what's going to happen. He's going to cry. She's going to walk the aisle again. They're going to hang on each other. All this kind of stuff. You can predict it because you've seen it over and over and over again. And as a young person, we're very impatient. It just takes too long. Microwave ovens are made for young people.
I don't know. Sometimes old people are impatient too. I'm just
Okay.
saying.
Okay.
Just saying. Shut up, Steve.
It's significant that Brother Steve.
Hold on, Preston. You can't hear Diane.
Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Richard Blanchard 20 minutes to think up the lyrics and write the music
For this song.
for that song in 1953.
Okay. So you know what? I would tell you that 20 minutes for those of you who've ever written poetry, et cetera, or maybe even music, seems to be a short period of time. unless you know your material. And the folks of the 40s and 50s were a lot more scripturally literate than we are. Now, I'm not telling you that they were more spiritual, that they were more holy. What I'm telling you, though, is the Bible was not just a coffee table book. It was certainly beginning to become a coffee tabletop book, but a lot more regular people were scripturally literate. And so by taking a look at that encounter in John chapter 4, his inspiration to write what he thought this young lady was processing and then how it counterbalanced the rest of her life, I think 20 minutes is significant if you know the material. It's like when you sit down to take a standardized test and you don't need Kaplan because you're ready to do it. Just get through it. It's done. That's how this gentleman was inspired and wrote this, because this is what he took from the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, in her encounter with Jesus. And there's some pretty deep concepts here. Bread of heaven, fill me till I want no more. What does that mean to you when you hear that? Here's my cup, Lord. I lift it up, Lord. What's going on here?
This, and if I'm jumping ahead or misapplying, I apologize right ahead. But this is Jimmy want more in a different way. He's saying, I want more of Jesus. I want to walk closer. Just a closer walk kind of thing. I want to be filled with a different kind of motivation, a different kind of attitude, a different kind of world and worldview. This is a craving. I want more of what I really ought to be having rather than what I got.
I couldn't have explained that better, Brother Gene.
I did something right today.
Yes, you did something right today, Jim.
This song puts in perspective those things which we can attain on our own and those things that only Jesus can provide. There's a very distinct contrast. And I would challenge in some regard, in order to have the sense of delight and the sense of contentment that we've been talking about, this has got to be your theme. When this is the guiding light, the guiding sentry for us, then we can start to sing that song that folks like and is popular. This is the air I breathe. Right? Because other than that, if we're not saying, Lord, you gave me a cup. Here's my cup. You fill my cup up with you. Other than that, when Sherry describes and says, well, some days I feel like I'm content, and then some days I don't. Well, that's where it comes from. Because we're not holding our cup out. But we are, if you think about Oliver Twist, which is one of my favorite lines, please, sir, can I have some more? Well, the more is what you got, what I think I should have, and not what it is that is about what Jesus can put in my cup. Now, I'm doing a little churchified stuff for you on this, but right now we're really focused on 2 Corinthians 12, 7 through 10, and how Paul, in the midst of all this stuff, can say, I delight in weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecution. So let me pause there for a second, because if you have the wherewithal, where are you in this fill my cup, Lord spectrum?
I want to congratulate you for how far you've grown from this time, and this when you were wishing this to be over in church, because now you're citing this as a mantra, as a theme. This is fantastic. You know, such maturity.
Well, I think if most people are being honest, we're probably not completely filled, right? With it. We get sidetracked with life and we get focused on other things.
Some days I ain't even got a cut.
That's right. Some days it's just more like, get me through. Well, some days it's more like just get me through today so that I can try again tomorrow. So yeah, we want to be filled. We want to always be filled, but sometimes that is hard because of everything else that happens.
So Sarah, let me even ask this, because I like that you said this, but you know what? I'm going to challenge this, and you guys push back. I don't know that churchers. By the way, you got to give credit to Bruce for that. I don't know if church professing, church going people. I don't know that we want to be filled with Jesus.
Well, you got to be. Some do. Some think they are, and some could care less. Right? Because there are some that, yes, we want to be and we try. Others are going through the motions, or others are thinking they're doing it, but really are just either going through the motions or don't have a clue.
I have to agree, Preston. I know I was going to say a lot of times I may be asking you to fill my cup, but with the wrong stuff. I'm asking, not him, the wrong stuff.
I think it's a matter of who's in charge. Because I think a lot of Christians want the Lord to fill their cup. I meet them all the time. I meet a lot of them. The thing is, they want to tell him what to fill the cup with. And by its very definition, when you're asking him to fill, what you should be saying is, you decide what to put in the cup. I mean, it goes back to this whole thing you guys are talking about with Christian nationalism. All of this stuff. I mean, what I see in the Christian culture today is people want to live their lives. Oh, and by the way, I want Jesus to bless it. That's the Christian experience in the 21st century. Lord, stay in your lane. We'll get together a couple times a week, maybe, if you're lucky. The rest of the time, it's on me. And so, I mean, that's kind of the Christian experience. And I got to admit, I'm guilty of that as well. You get up in the morning and hopefully you pray, but how often do we actually pray something similar to this song? Because the kind of the corollary to fill my cup is be filled with the Spirit. That's where it's got to start from. And that means I'm laying down the reins to my life and you live my life. And when I mentioned the Christian nationalism, we got to stop being so concerned about our stinking rights, because dead men have no rights, period, end of story. And if we were more concerned about the things of God and not so much about whether or not we're being offended, I think you might see a little change. Sorry, I won't get off on that, Jake.
I like that, Bruce. And to be honest, that has put into perspective all this whole Slack discussion, because and we are overly preoccupied with what's going on down here, when we need to be more preoccupied with where we're headed and whether or not other folks are going with us. I appreciate that. And oh my, that's just huge. And the other thing that came to my mind as we're talking about this is something we talked about a few weeks ago. Filling needs to be actually overflowing. We need to be filling to the point where it spills out onto other people as we go about, as we go. And I think if we get to that place, then things will change without having to do like Peter did and raise a sword.
So young upstart Peter could likely be confronted by older Peter, who would say, young man, some of those actions and some of that thinking was not the best thinking. This is elevated thinking. This is elevated operation. And so young Peter, especially before Acts chapter 2 and the advent of the Holy Spirit, young Peter was operating in the tools that he thought he knew best. And that was his mouth, his fishing prowess, and potentially the ability to cut off parts of you with something sharp I have. If we're indeed praying people equipped by Jesus to impact this world for the next, folks, those operating instructions sound very, very simple. But when we get an article or two like Steve's, when we get a challenge and pushback from Diane, when we get the confusion that Diane says can kind of sink into us when we go, how do we encounter people? Folks, the very beginning of our mantra / our mission statement is praying people. So like this song, because here's the funny thing. This is a song a guy wrote, but it's actually a prayer. So if you can't figure out how to pray, by the way, because that really is rolling out. Trust me, it really is. Find a song that puts you in a prayerful state that says, Holy Spirit, Jesus, Yahweh, equip me so I know what I'm going to do next. Because we're going to feel more and more challenged to go out and interact with folks the way that Diane kind of presents, that fine line is going to exist when we're not relying on prayer. When we're not communing with the Godhead and going, can you help me figure out what to do? Because I ain't got a clue. I'm going to walk in and I'm going to spill the milk on this bad boy. Can you tell me the words to say? That's why we want to be prayerful people, recognizing, right, that we rely on prayer to interact with the Godhead. Discussion, conversation, and we're allowed to do that through Jesus' death, right? We don't need a priest to do that. And then be equipped by Jesus. That's all the gifts of the Spirit. So we got that as a backup. And then we recognize that the idea is to use that combination, prayer and the gifts that we have, and the gifts that we have even as a group, to impact this world for the one that's coming. And folks, that's kind of the conversation content. When we're talking with folks who have gender dysphoria, when we're talking with folks who are struggling with abortion versus God made women have a choice, right? We want to be able ultimately to lead people to understand the world we're living in is not the only one. There's a world to come. And that ultimately is where we want to prepare people, folks. So when I was a child, I spoke like a child, right? But now that I'm big, I should be operating differently. Paraphrase, by the way, by a book I know. So it's real easy for me to take a look at this song that just seems to be one of boredom and, like Gene says, where my sausage and biscuits at, and not recognize the import of the content here, that someone was inspired enough to say, this is what my closer walk with the Lord, with Jesus, every day should look like. Here's my cup. And I like that Brother Jerry says this. Sometimes I don't even know if I got a cup. Well, maybe the first thing that you do, and this is what Bruce said, during the course of your morning, find the cup. And then say, Lord, you gave me the cup. Can you put you in it and overfill it to the point where there's so little of me, I'm not worried about it. By the way, that's your 23rd Psalm. My cup, it's not half empty, it's not half full. That bad boy is not even full, it's running over. That's why David gets the credit that he gets as a man after God's own heart. Because in spite of his stupid decisions, in spite of his stupid mistakes, he loved Jesus in a way that maybe we don't quite fathom. So let me pause there for just a second, give you a little room to comment or to add your thinking.
Can't add to that.
I want to say, praying the fruits of the Spirit.
Mm.
I'm convicted a lot about that because, especially the self-control part, you know, taking care of a lot of people and you don't get that care back.
Mm.
After a while, you almost get resentful and you almost have to keep refilling that cup. I mean, it's hard.
Mm.
If you don't do it daily, you know, it's easy to fall back on your old sinful self that's all about me.
So, folks, I hope that you're recognizing, and let me use a term today, but let's usurp it correctly. We're trying to pivot, and we're trying to pivot instilling something. You've heard me say over the years we've been together that I'm a fan of adult education differently than I am youngsters, because I love watching adults' light bulbs turn on. But I also enjoy, and Steve made reference to this earlier, I also love when adults are learning stuff and they don't realize they're learning stuff. And then one day they wake up and they go, oh, I know some stuff. What Diane said, folks, is such a big reality because we have grown up in a society. And folks, when I say society, and I spend a lot of time with this, Western and American society, we look for, whether we say it or not, we look for attaboys. We look for kudos. Here's the pivot, folks, and this is why in some ways we're helping with the mission statement and some of the trainings and the teachings and the discussions that we have. We are trying to help us to pivot, to turn into something that is against our nature as Americans, and maybe against our nature as humans. Here's what it is. We have to learn how to be servants without the expectation of anything back. We have to learn how to go and serve even when people are thankless toward us. By the way, if you struggle with this, a great model would be the Lord Jesus. We have to be in positions to go and help hold people's arms up, to go into situations where we've been asked, but folks might not show a sense of gratitude or a sense of thank you, because the idea is for us to be servants. And if we adopt a great servant mindset, it's going to get easier for us to wade into the difficult surf because we understand that we're putting our life on the line, but who cares? Because if we lay our life on the line for the Lord Jesus, we get to pick it up again. So a lot of our lessons and discussions over the past few years have been readying us to pivot, to be less about people being grateful toward us and us being agape servants. Oops, sorry, Gene. Us being servants without looking for something. So let me pause because that's a mouthful.
Why you said I'm sorry?
Say it again.
Well, I don't know why you said I'm sorry.
I used the Greek word.
Well, so will he later.
At least one.
I would challenge folks based on what Diane just said. And this is going to sound a little crazy. Churches are in the business of getting thanked. You guys agree?
Again,
She said churches are in the business of being
I
thanked,
think
right?
that's are, not aren't.
Yeah, I said are.
Okay.
And why do you say that, Preston?
I would say yes.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
But I would say a lot of churches are looking for thanks from people, but you want to hear you're a good faithful servant. That's the thanks that you want. So yeah. But not maybe necessarily in the way that you meant it.
I think he's looking at it more like we're looking at people to thank us for what we do for them, as opposed to what the ultimate goal is, to hear the well done, good and faithful servant.
And thus the human condition
Mhm.
has invaded the congregation so that we are placating them so that we'll get them to come be a part of us.
Well, we've imposed on a church where we want to be because we want to be thanked for what we do all the time. We think we're that good, right? So we've imposed that human condition, right, on the church.
Mhm.
We know what the Bible says about wanting human accolades.
Well,
And I think it's hard to go from, you, especially if you have a job, you get that if you're lucky and you do a good job, where you got to flip that on its ear and not expect human things. It's all about what you're doing for God and His reputation.
Mhm.
That's a hard one.
it is because it's a thankless job is what it should be.
You should be rejoicing in that.
Correct, but that is a hard thing to do as a human being because it is supposed to be a thankless job.
I need to be better about when I'm in that valley, when I need some things, or I feel like I need that things to call somebody and just say, talk me through this, get my mind around, and I don't do it. But I do pray about it, and that sort of helps. But yeah, it's hard.
And Diane, I really love when you do what you're doing right now. Sherry will do this too. Sarah does it with a thought bubble, but I love when you do this, which is exposing how badly we blow it. Because that's why we do this the way that we do this. Let me tell you, folks, look, Brother Gene, Bruce, and I, we have kind of a midweek pick-me-up between the three of us. And we may have nothing really to discuss except being able to meet midweek is a huge encourager. And what that also does is that makes us comfortable enough building a relationship that now we don't need a set date to reach out to each other. We can just reach out to each other. And there's a delight in that community. And folks, unless we network the right way, unless we find folks with similarities in, because they're the right folks to associate with in churches, they're the right social strata of people, we don't connect with people that way. And our churches wind up being exactly what Brother Gene talked about. They're about placating folks. Look, let me give you a couple of things to think about. I believe very strongly, especially when we're looking at James and John, and then they get their mommy to ask Jesus, who's going to be the leaders or who's going to be on your right side and left side after you're gone. Even Peter, in some of his commentary, those dudes were focused on popularity, gain, even though they were exposed to the living incarnation of the creator of all. Now, after Jesus' death, resurrection, and Pentecost, them dudes were not focused on the right now anymore. They were focused on the next. What comes next? They changed their focus from what's pleasing to man to let's do what gets us closer to well done, good and faithful servant. So we get to watch that transition happen for these 12 plus dudes who then encounter the risen Jesus and then are impacted truly by the Holy Spirit, and their whole focus changes from the what's going to happen right now to we need to be worried. We need to be focused on hearing and seeing the Lord again where he says, well done, good and faithful servants. And then let me throw this last thought out for you to comment on or to respond to. So I was talking to my wife this week about this. And one of the reasons that I talk about Western world, the United States culture, is because we don't understand sometimes, because even though we have the opportunity to travel a lot more, America is still kind of isolationist. We think that we're the empire. Other people need to kind of conscript to the way we do things and how we operate. That's why when we go abroad, we expect people to understand English. That's why we also speak a lot louder when we, if not go abroad, when we speak to people that are in call centers that are off the mainland, because we believe it's our special right to help translate by speaking louder. And one of the comments I made to my wife this week was this. and if you're honest, you'll embrace this unless I'm just so wrong. Americans believe it is their right, and this is what Bruce mentioned earlier. Americans really rail about their rights. And this is one that's not constitutional, but it seems to be an American practice. We believe that it is our job to complain about our job. And here's the fun thing. Some of us get paid neat amounts of money. And when we first take the job, we're very pleased with the amount of money that we contract through that employer to get. But after a period of time, we then begin to complain that it's not enough. And so the American or the Western mindset, but particularly the American mindset, is bent against contentment. It's already predisposed that at some point in time, we're going to complain. Now, if I were going to contrast that with a different society, for instance, let me throw out for you the Indian society. And I don't mean Native Americans. I mean India, like Punjabi, et cetera. India, over there, India. So in India, there are 4 caste systems. And unfortunately, you're born into one of those based on who your parents are. And the Indians never rail against moving from the different stratification and classes. They are content to remain in the class that they're born in, the Brahma class or the unwashed. They're content to be there, and they don't try to present unhappiness or extreme dissatisfaction because they believe that it's their karma of a sort. We're talking a Hindu nation, right? It's their karma of sorts that what is, que sera, sera. What is what will be. And so they don't rail against that. So they have a different sense of contentment than Americans do. So let me pause there because I'm mostly finished. You guys get to push back or comment a little bit on that.
Interesting thought about the Eastern Indian. These aren't, let me just ask it in a question. Aren't these the same people that believe also in reincarnation? So maybe next time they'll get something better?
No. Next time they get what they deserve. That's why when Kafka becomes a cockroach, he's okay with that because that's the lot that his karma determines for him. And since we're talking Indian.
Hold on, I think I missed something. Sorry, Preston. I thought I unmuted. Said again.
So that sounds very fatalistic.
No, I don't think it's fatalistic at all. It's a group of people from a nationalist standpoint that are content with their lot. And if they move up or down the evolutionary scale, that's okay. Ideally, they want to become part of the universal one.
Okay, so, you are much better versed in this than I am. So there's not a possibility that when they die, content in the caste that they were born in, that they're not going to come back as human in a different caste and get promoted, quote unquote, and so they're not looking forward to a new situation in the next life because their karma has warranted that.
So you're almost thinking about that from an American standpoint. Let me throw this out so this helps you. If you believe as a culture in reincarnation, there are endless opportunities to be reborn. So it's not just the one opportunity. There are thousands of lifetimes, and each one presents a different challenge. As opposed to, in the next life, I hope in the next life, life goes on interminably with a reincarnation cycle.
Agreed. And my understanding or my attempt to understand the sense of contentment with the caste system is it only applies to people. And they can get reincarnated to a different class of the person, or their lifetime may be the lifetime of a housefly next. And so that may not take long for them to get to the cockroach invention, or the cat, or the cow, heaven forbid, that kind of thing. So that they've got, and if you're Hindu, you is there such a thing as a Hindu orchid man?
Gene, I think you're just kind of missing the whole point here. It's not about all of that. I think, because I know people that are practicing Hindus here. My last real estate client was a practicing Hindu. I think the point is, and you don't have to go to India to find this, is that it's an amazing thing that other faith systems seem to have a better leg up on contentment than we, who serve the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And I am challenged by that on a regular basis, that I see people that they seem more at peace than I do sometimes. And I go, what the heck? I've got the Holy Spirit indwelling me. I have the truth of God's word in my very possession. And they are chasing after a system that is flawed and futile, and, by the way, a lie. And yet somehow they're able to find contentment in that lie. That is such a brain blower that's the case, when we should be the ones. And I could give you some other thoughts, but yeah, that for me is kind of, I think, where Preston's trying to get to is, why is that? Why can they be peaceful? And we who know peace, a peace that passes all understanding, seem to not be at peace.
I can share another example. Having grown up in the Middle East, my father worked for an oil company. And dealing with the Muslim culture, not so much the religion, but the culture there. A lot of times we would hear this, trying to get somebody to do some work. And you would hear the common response was, Mabruk, inshallah, tomorrow, God willing. To the Muslim culture, they don't have a choice. They are not in control of their lives. Allah has written it for them. And so their contentment also shows up there.
So this is my point. They're not focused on what they're in right now. They're focused on the life that lies ahead. And if we are able to, as Bruce pointed out, focus on the life that we have eternally ahead, we can experience a different kind of contentment here. The point I was trying to make with all of that silliness was, they're not caught up in what the here and now is, because they've got a sense of what's coming next, whether it be a new incarnation or eternity, or 78 virgins, as the Muslims might think, or whatever. They're caught up in the 770, whatever. I don't care. So the idea is, they're looking forward and we're not. That's why we're not content. We think so many people who claim to be Christians are stuck with what they've got here. They don't look beyond the constraints that right now has. And we need to get better at that. As Bruce said, we need to look forward more to what heaven is and get excited about that and be more mindful of that. And then not only does contentment come, now we also are more eternity minded to talk to people about the overflowing, just to go back to where we started, the overflowing we're experiencing, so that other folks can join in with it.
Thank you for that, Brother Gene, and Bruce, and Chris, thank you for that too, because, for years, one of the things we've talked about is that the Muslims are a better theocracy than Christians are, even culturally. When I think about Steve's discussion this week in regard to Christian nationalists and then arming ourselves kind of with the Second Amendment and the rosary in the other hand. When I think about Diane's discussion, and Diane also talking about the fine line that it exists, and how do we address and how do we deal with folks that want to identify a certain way without losing an opportunity. Folks, look, it has to do with what we're talking about. If we're always looking forward, and if we're always looking forward, that a part of our job description is what we do needs to lead to well done, good and faithful servants, then the praying people equipped by Jesus to impact this world for the next becomes more real. And that means, here's a crazy thing. You guys have heard me tell you stories about how disappointed my wife and I are in the decisions our kids have made in terms of their eternity. But now that we've accepted that, and now that we're having very frank conversations this way, we spend at least some of the time we interact with the kids, maybe having fun and having some light conversation, and then we talk with them about Jesus. Because at some point in time, we realize this. We realize that we're going to be in agreement about Jesus's decision about the rest of mankind who don't determine that Jesus is their Lord. We're going to be in agreement with that. So we're working to do everything we can, especially for those folks that we say that we care about, to not have us to make a determination that we're glad that they're forever separated from Yahweh. And if that means peeving them off right now, if that means getting them ripped about things right now, if that better impacts them for eternity in a positive sense, then doggone it, we're going to be about that. And that means that sometimes we're doing things that feel thankless right now, but we're not supposed to be in a position to get thank yous. We're in a position to do kingdom business, to impact this world for the next. And it means that people aren't going to pat us on the back. People sometimes don't even want to see us coming. But that doesn't mean we don't have jobs to do. Comments, feedback, I'm done there. Thank you, by the way, for indulging. Thank you, Brother Gene and Brother Steve, for letting me cut into your time. Thoughts, comments, responses? I brought a mallet or a hammer to the party, but I think that was the right thing to bring in today. So, have I crushed anybody's feelings or thoughts about their walk with Jesus?
I just have one interjection. They're more content, but they don't have Satan against them like we do, pitting us against each other, pitting us with temptation, because they don't have him as an adversary. And yes, what you said, they're much more content, as we should be seeking, well done, thou good and faithful servant, but they don't have the adversary that we do. They're not in that constant battle that we have.
Some truth to that. I was just going to comment, and it sounds very, very trite on the heels of such an insightful comment. I'm still wondering if there's a Hindu orphan, and I'm sorry.
I really wish that Daniel and Nathan were here to have heard that, because yeah.
Is that water pistol loaded?
We can make it.
I don't know that other religions or faiths don't have a devil. I guess maybe they just don't acknowledge it as we do. But other religions do have their sects or their divisions within their religions. For example, the Muslim has the Shiite versus the Sunni, and they hate each other, and they are always fighting with each other. Who's right? Who's wrong? What's motivating that hatred? Some evil devil person that they don't acknowledge? I don't know. Just a thought.
I think I would argue that the adversary is the adversary. He might not need to be as active against, say, a Hindu or a Muslim, but nonetheless, I mean, the Bible teaches us that if you're making sacrifices to idols, you're making sacrifices to demons. Just because you don't believe that in Yahweh God, it doesn't erase his existence because you don't believe. Likewise, just because you may not believe in Satan of the Bible doesn't erase his existence. So I would think that whatever religion you're in, the adversary is still active. I think you follow the religion that you follow because of the activity of the adversary.
Yeah, I think Pam's point though is because they're not making inroads for the kingdom. He's not pestering them.
Right.
That is what I meant.
Right. I would agree with that. But to me, I think that he's still present. He's still working. He just doesn't need to work very hard for this, folks.
For real.
I would also say that I like the term or the use of the term servant, because a lot of times we don't like to think of ourselves that way. But I mean, if you picture yourself as, say, a servant during the time of ancient Rome, you didn't perform a service for your master and then hang around and wait for them to say thank you. It wasn't the thank you was maybe you got to eat that day.
Yeah.
There wasn't, So I think if you think in those terms that you're a servant, you shouldn't be hanging around and waiting for somebody to say thank you.
Preston, if you brought up hammer and bringing a saw, I think we have to be careful about where our discontent comes from. I think that if we are, and I'm not going to say 100% obedient, but I think if we're striving to serve the Lord, the enemy is going to put a lot more things in our path. I would contend to say that for a substantial percentage of legitimate believing Christians who are not in line with where the Lord would have them, I think the discontent is probably more stirred by the Holy Spirit than he is by Satan. So I just leave that out there.
Chris, you got a thought?
Not so much, faith-based, but you're talking about the differences between cultures, the Western culture, the American culture versus the old world culture, and how content or non-content we are versus how they are. Is that necessarily a bad thing? Aren't most inventions created by lack of contentment or wanting something better? Isn't the Western culture, the United States, America, the greatest invention, a greatest invention engine, because we're not content with what we are? The light bulb, car came from Europe, airplane, cell phone, WebEx. More things have been invented in the last 150 years than the last 2,000 years. And most of it came from the Western discontent.
So, Chris, this is that's a wonderful point to make. And if we had longer, and if we were not necessarily just a faith-based group, we would talk about the mother of invention and the necessity for invention, because that we have the electric light, that we have Mr. Benz having created the car. Thank you for alluding to that. That we have traffic lights and vacuum cleaners and HVAC and indoor plumbing. All of those things ameliorate or make our lives better, right? But we have kind of we have a material life in terms of the plateau in which we live right now, and recognizing that this is not eternity. And looking to make our lives better, whether it's even to make a wheel or to have fire, is not a bad thing. It's a bad thing when it interrupts our feeling about eternity, because we're more impacted by what happens now and pleasing myself now than pleasing he who created us. And when Diane also brings up the concept of, the fine line, when you talk about invention and when we talk about empires, look, folks, some of the most endearing and enduring inventions and creations we have come as a matter of conflict. So conflict's not a bad thing unless you live and rest there. Conflict sometimes is an opportunity to do something that I appreciate that Brother Bruce thinks all the time, statesmanship. It means you have to negotiate and compromise and sometimes have discourse so that it doesn't stay a negative and an impacting for the negative event. And in responding to Pam's comment, she's right on target, folks, in terms of being beset by the adversary. Here's the remedy for that. What we're doing right now and what we attempt to do during the course of the week. That's why the Lord put the church together, because the community is what allows us, in addition to the full armor of God, allows us to repel the adversary so that his impact in many ways is slight and fleeting. That's why we gather, folks. That's why we talk about our failures, our lack of initiation, our, like Brother Jerry said, that we don't have cups to ask the Lord to fill with. That's why we meet, because by having a servant's heart and being candid about our partial successes, our successes, and our failures, that allows us to regroup and go, guess what, adversary, we're going to come back better and stronger because we got the equipment and you don't, and we just have to use it the right way because I haven't been doing that. And then you can add a little bit of boo-boo. Na. But please do that according to Luke chapter 4, because na will get you lit up. So make sure Luke chapter 4 is how you address the adversary. So anything else out there? Thank you all for your contributions. Thank you all. The passion here is going to stay with me, if not during the week, certainly for the day.